There was debate going on with historians of the skeptics who say, like, yeah, this is really bad, but it's not fascism.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch in New York City.
And one of their big objections was, well, there's no expansionist element to it. And it's sort of the good old days when we weren't going to take over Greenland and Gaza.
The title was provocative. There are no faces. The Substack article was blood-chilling. The author is the brutally observant and painfully honest writer Jeff Sharlet. He's spent a lot of time inside the MAGA movement trying to understand the appeal of Trump and reporting on it with insight and empathy. But he also sees the cruelty and, in his words, the joy of fascism, and describes it in a way that few people can. This week, Jeff is back with us on The State of Belief. We need voices like that of Jeff Sharlet to be heard now more than ever. Make sure you subscribe, share, and rate The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Our library of past interviews includes well over 100 hopeful, empowering interviews with guests like Bishop William Barber, author Catherine Stewart, historian Tim Snyder, and Reverend Jackie Lewis, and many others. You can help grow The State of Belief with a financial contribution right now. Find out how at stateofbelief.com, and you can support and join the work of Interfaith Alliance at interfaithalliance.org. Before we get started, there's something that I just want to say to you, the listeners of The State of Belief. This is such a crucial moment, and I want to make an invitation to make sure that you are connected somehow with people and organizations that are inviting you into productive ways of raising your voice, being present, getting out into the world, showing up. Because right now, if we don't show up, it's tacit approval. We need to figure out. Now, I recognize not everybody can get out in front, but everybody can do something. And I invite you, listener, to think about what might you do right now, because we're in a pivotal moment. So much is happening. We can get overwhelmed. But so much is happening. Please look around. Find ways to show up. Find ways to make your voice heard right now, whether that's on the street at a demonstration, whether that is at a town hall, whether that is at a city council meeting, whatever it is, make sure you don't absent yourself from the incredible moment that very much needs each one of you. Each one of you who is listening, please know that you are needed in this moment of crisis for our democracy. So I look forward to hearing from you about what kinds of things you feel called to do. If you can go on our website, you can see if there's an Interfaith Alliance in your state or in your community. If there isn't one, you could even think about starting one, but we want to be a resource for you. So please reach out to Interfaith Alliance that sponsors this podcast and that I'm the president of, and know that I'm thinking of you as I hope you consider what way you are called to show up for our democracy in this moment. And now to my guest. In difficult times, the work of truth-telling can seem like obsessing on the negative, but the important truths are often very uncomfortable and even frightening. Jeff Sharlet doesn't just tell the stories, he clearly also lets the truth get to him, because that's the price of really seeing and understanding the people he writes about. Jeff Sharlet is the best-selling author of books like The Undertow, Scenes from a Slow Civil War. His book, The Family, was turned into a powerful Netflix series, and his Substack is a must-read at Scenes from a Slow Civil War. Jeff, welcome back to The State of Belief, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, Paul. Good to be with you.
So, we first spoke, not the first time we've ever spoken, but first spoke on this podcast almost a year ago, about actually 11 months ago, on the publication of your amazing book, scenes from the undertow scenes from a slow civil war. You now have a Substack, and you've added some words that read, "It's speeding up." So the slow civil war is speeding up, and we're in a moment here. And I remember, when we first talked, you said, "I've been reluctant for so long to use the word fascism. I don't. I'm less reluctant now." Just tell me your kind of opening perspective on this moment that we're in America.
I mean, the good news, I always start with the good news is I don't think we have a fascist regime yet. We have a fascist movement in control of our government, and that's different than the regime. It hasn't fully con as much power as it seized so quickly, and and what's astonishing to me, I think, is even quicker than those of us who are watching closely, and we're not the naysayers, we're the ones who are like, this is bad, this is bad. It hasn't yet fully consolidated for all sorts of reasons. So that's the good news. We
Can you
have a
can you say more
fascist
about
movement in
that?
control of our government, but it's not yet a regime.
And so tell me about like that distinction with a difference.
Yeah.
What are the things to look for as we parse out what you just said?
So, elements of fascism that we want to speak of when we use that term, and there's the popular kind of interpreters like in the scholars, Timothy Snyder, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, Federico Finkelstein is a writer who I think is really wonderful scholar who resisted it until about 2020. Much like Robert Paxton is a great historian, a book called Anatomy of Fascism. I think we talked about before, and but when we look at the Trump regime, we have obviously a cult of personality. That's a given. We have the othering, the organization of not just a politics but an aesthetic around the other, which we oppose with. Um, I'm using the we. I'm speaking in this broad sense. I'm not part of this this
Yeah.
gang, which they oppose with a kind of uh, gleeful anger, right? So we're talking about joy, and one of the frightening things is there is a lot of joy within fascism. The uninhibited rage turned into something like Christopher Rufo, who is the architect of the assault on DEI and on Department of Education. New York Times has said he's basically dictating education policy by tweet now. And one of those tweets yesterday was so vulgar, so hateful against trans people, so conspiratorial about this alleged trans brigade within the U.S. intelligence apparatus that he sounded like Joe McCarthy, um, except worse. Um, we have all those elements. There were some elements. There was debate going on with historians of the skeptics who say like, yeah, this is really bad, but it's not fascism. Um, and one of their big objections was, well, there's no expansionist element to it. And it's
Ha
sort of
ha.
the good old days when we weren't going to take over Greenland and Gaza and
Canada.
Canada and essentially Ukraine.
Yeah.
Ukraine
Right.
just fell to a Hitler-Stalin pact,
Right.
or is falling now, right? And they may survive, but at the cost of massive amounts of wealth. And so I think all these are the elements of fascism. But the reason I say it's not yet a regime um, is we do have these sort of vestiges of rule of law that are in place. They're kind of falling by the day. I'm coming to this conversation from having taught a class, and so I've been away for 2 hours, so I don't know what's happened since then, except that as I was walking here, I discovered that in my state of New Hampshire, where my college campus is, the state police are seeking to be deputized as ICE agents with the power to stop anybody, anywhere, anytime, and ask them about their immigration status. Um, uh, it's, you know,
Yeah.
that wasn't there this morning, and now it is. So it's
Yeah.
moving that quickly, but they're asking for that. They haven't yet been given that power. The courts are trying to hold on. It's true that Trump is mostly blasting through the court rulings, and some courts are acquiescing. Uh, we think of the institution that we're both involved in, which is journalism, right? Yesterday, with the Washington Post, I don't know when this airs, but recently with the Washington Post and Jeff Bezos's declaration that, we're not even going to pretend to be a newspaper anymore. Right now, I have these two things that I think are important: free markets as defined by an oligarch, Jeff Bezos, and personal liberties as defined by a guy who is courting the approval of the Trump administration and all its hate. That's going to be what's in our paper. And we're not, literally says, we're not going to make room for dissenting voices.
It's
E-
wild. I mean,
But even
you know,
so, that's not consolidation because they haven't purged the paper. There are still good reporters at the Washington Post. And I urge people, oh, remember, there's good reporters at the Washington Post. There's good people working in federal government trying to hold on, trying to hold on. And it
yeah,
is incumbent upon us to not forget that and not give in and to be in solidarity with them.
100%. And your part of your background is really looking at the way that kind of Christian slash militia slash identity movements have been an underground over the past decades. And Scenes from a Slow Civil War, which is just one of the most extraordinary essays I've ever written, I would say, and I've ever read. Necessary reading. It feels like, when you were writing that and when I was reading, I was like, what an interesting underground movement. And it feels much less underground now. How do you factor in the kind of Christian nationalists, Christian identity movements, Christian militias into what's happening now that they're guys in the White House?
They're guys in the White House. They're not the underground you and I are. And I write about that in the book. I mean, I remember at one point a Trump supporter sort of sharing with me some crazy conspiracy theories. And at the time I was out there when I met her, I was reporting for Vanity Fair magazine. And and it was just sort of a pivot. I remember I was sitting in her Cadillac outside a Trump rally. She was showing me this crazy stuff, and then I look up, and it was actually a congressman talking on Tucker Carlson sharing this conspiracy theory, and I realized she's not the fringe. I am, and that's I think that's sad for those of us who care about accuracy and facts and truth and care for one another. Um, but as we recognize it, it can turn uh, um, into a strength. And yeah, I'll pause there. I don't know about you,
Yeah,
Paul, but I find myself so many times these days uh, um, getting lost in the swirl of things. And I think
yeah.
it's also fair for us to acknowledge that. And I think a lot of us are experiencing that. Um, and to acknowledge that, and then, you know, say to the other person, Paul, you pick it up from there.
Yeah, I
You
think
carry
that's
it now.
totally fair.
Yeah.
And I think it's especially true for people like you who really are in storytelling because the thread is so easily lost in this moment. Like
Yeah.
what is really happening? And that's by intention. I mean I have the benefit in some ways of being the president of an organization that is dedicated to action. And so like I'm interested in telling stories, but I'm also interested in how do we respond in real time to what's happening, and how do we push back as hard as we can in this moment. So one of the things that we've been really doing is trying as much as we can with our ability to push back against the Christian nationalism coming out of the White House and saying, actually, you're the ones who are attacking religion over and over and over again, and really trying to put them a little bit on the defensive and just stating the narrative. That's one arena, and then working closely with litigators and organizations like Democracy Forward, who are really filing lawsuits around ICE and other things. So figuring out ways that we can speak into what's happening, and in some ways I think slow the kind of fascist march or the march towards fascism so that more and more people can look around and say, oh, okay, I'm beginning to see what's happening. And I do think that in some ways buying time now so that
Yes.
people can understand like more and more that this isn't what we signed up for. This isn't exactly, there's going to be there's going to be a very, very motivated core constituency that has grown. But I do think that if we can buy time and if we can actually buy time so that we can have a next election, that we will be able to motivate people to come out more and more and more and show a sign of resistance, which feels very, very important right now, and not to kind of give in to the inevitability of the dominance of the kind of Trump and Elon Musk movement. That's how I'll pick up
Yeah.
your pause in some ways because we do slightly different things. I think it's really important that we support one another also on this moment and recognize that there's lots of ways to be responding in this moment, and let's all find a way.
Yeah, I think, one of the things I keep coming back to, which is what I see, and we may have talked about this before, the first lie of fascism is inevitability.
Right.
Um, and and the way I think, as a writer and maybe as an activist, the way we speak back to that lie is you tell the story, and your commitment is to telling the story because it's true, not because it will necessarily work, right?
Right.
I'm going to tell this story as truthfully and accurately as I can because I want to tell the true story. And I understand that that story may not land. I mean, yesterday or the other day with the Washington Post, and a lot of people were very angry at the Washington Post, and they were cursing out anyone who would still work there. Um, and so, in speaking for the reporters who I know who are trying to do good work within or trying to do good work within State Department or whatever else, right? Um, that's actually not the most effective story. I could have cultivated and sort of shared that anger and, a pox on them all. Um, but that's the sort of the left version of giving in to the inevitability of fascism lie, which is, wait a minute, this story is complicated. And if we insist on those complications at every step without ever losing sight of the simplicity of care versus hate is really quite powerful. And I think the uh, there's a great temptation all around now, and I think toward categorization, toward dealing with the flip side of the inevitability of fascism is lie, or fascism is lies. Maybe I give in to fascism because there's no resisting it, or maybe I tune out. But there's another risk that I think is not as always as visible to those of us affiliated with the left, which is um, uh, maybe I interpret that great old labor song, which I love, as "Which side are you on?" as an excuse to not do the hard work of solidarity, which is what the
Mm.
song is all about, right?
Uh-huh.
Um, so I can say, I'm just gonna bash, you know, I'm gonna bash the folks who I think are wobbly on this issue or not. And what you said about buying time is so essential because part of buying time is solidarity,
Right.
collaboration work. Even the Democrats right now who are driving me insane, like so many of us, in as much as any of them slows the process at all, um, I know which side they're on. I may disagree with them on tactics, but I know which side they're on.
Yeah. I think that's super important. And part of what I hear you saying is like, let's remember that there's people involved because like I think, when we think about journalists and you and me less than you, but like I've been in I've been in editorial rooms. Like people really actually are trying to tell good stories. I mean, it's not, a lot of them, not all of them, but and and also civil servants. And I think that part of like what we view actually as a part of a tactic is to humanize the people who are being impacted by these drastic cuts, not only on the people who will lose services, but also these people. The hundreds of thousands of people who are just being summarily dismissed. Up next, much more with the author, Jeff Sharlet. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You'll also find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. And make sure you subscribe at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch. My guest is writer Jeff Sharlet. I love hearing you talk. I even more, not that I'm not enjoying this conversation, but I do love your writing. I mean, it's really, and I'm married to a writer, and I really I appreciate words, and I appreciate when they are so really extraordinarily used to paint a story. But one that you told recently, and this is a plug for your Substack, I think it's a really important place, although it will not be your most fun visit of the day for the internet. So it comes with a warning. But There Are No Faces was something that I literally read with my mouth open, and but it was so important because the horror of it, and getting back in some ways to this glee of fascism. And so can you talk a little bit about that piece, just as one example of the kind of writing you're doing right now, and as an example of the danger that we are in?
Yeah, so this is There Are No Faces is about a video that was put out by the White House. It was called ASMR, Illegal Alien Deportation Flight. And then it had a little emoji of a stereo speaker to make sure you listen to it with sound. And it's a very different kind of propaganda. And I paid attention to it first because I try to keep track of those moments that even for me and fellow writers, activists who are long on the fascism beat, who have been calling this fascism for a while, who've been speaking to that, there's still moments when I did not quite see that one coming, right? And your breath just pauses, and that was my experience. This was put out on Twitter, and it's a 49-second video. ASMR, I can't remember what it stands for, audio sensory media and response. It's this whole genre of video that begins in the sort of early 2000s, where someone, speaks in a whispering voice, and they tap things, and they do like gentle sounds. It's sort of like it's the evolution of I'm going to listen to a recording of a stream or rain falling to fall asleep. These are sounds that give you sort of like shivers and tingles and so on. They give you pleasure. So in calling it ASMR, they're saying these are sounds that will give you pleasure. They're saying this will feel good. And you watch the video, it's it seems to be two men, although if you pay attention to it closely, you realize they've actually montaged a number of migrants, who is being chained, and we hear the chains pulled out of a crate, and we hear the links going against each other, and then we hear the click click of a man's hands, which we see being handcuffed behind his back, and then we see a close up, and there's never, as I say, there's never any faces. It's just body parts, the body dehumanized. We see the shackled feet of this person walking up the metal steps of the plane on which he's going to be sent away. 49 seconds, that's it. No argument. Um, it's just they want us to know they're taking pleasure in pain. It's it's a kind of bondage porn. It's a kind of BDSM. But even then, I think, the wink in that work, the wink, and for those for whom that's a kind of eroticism, is always that this isn't real, right? That there's a safe word and all these kinds of things, right? We're going to perform, we're going to play at this power relationship. The wink in this video, the wink that's coming from the White House is this is real. The pleasure is not in the pleasure. The pleasure is in the actual pain that we're inflicting. And I think it's really important to read those videos. It's a kind of coercive storytelling. Trolling is a kind of coercive storytelling. Um, and we want to dismiss trolling, but There's a difference when trolling comes from a jerk on the internet and it comes from the state
Mm.
trolling the public square. And it's coercive because it's not, you're going to play a role in it whether you want to or not. You may say, that's disgusting. I will not sully myself with that. I look away. You're the one who sees no evil. Or in trolling terms, you take the bait. And I took the bait. I wrote about it and I tried to read it. I tried to read it as a writer. I tried to read it just, and I did this with my students as well. I said, okay, let's read this like we're workshopping a story. What is the story they're telling? They're not trying to persuade people. There's nothing. If someone's like, yeah, I kind of think deportation's a good idea. I'm kind of on the fence. This is not going to persuade them. This is going to lose them. This was an expression. They were showing their contempt for persuasion and their commitment to coercion. And in telling that story, though, I do look, what threads can we pull? There's a reason there's no faces in that video. Um, and I think it has to do with the fact of some good reporting at the Washington Post by good reporters who are trapped working for Jeff Bezos. But they followed up a series of other propaganda videos put out the week before of Guantanamo Bay and the mass internment camps that are being built there. And Department of Homeland Security, Christy Nome strutting around in bell-bottom jeans and mirrored shades like this is a glamour shot. And they made the mistake in the background. You would see some of the imprisoned men who are all said to be, and I quote, the worst of the worst, dirtbags, members of this evil gang. And the Washington Post worked really hard and they were able to identify who six of these men were, five of whom had no criminal records whatsoever, one of whom had his only criminal record was after having been taken imprisoned. There was some kind of altercation in the prison. You know, they put them in the space. None of them had any gang affiliation at all. Most of them were family men. And in that piece, if people go and look at There Are No Faces, I decided to end with this photograph that the Washington Post had found of one of these men. Um, and he's just standing there and sort of, I don't know where it is. Maybe it's Christmas time or something. There's lights in the trees. He's got a nice outfit that he likes and he's smiling, this gentle smile. We can, that's not, we tell the story because it's true. We tell the story, this man is real. Um, Naming him, seeing his picture, that's not enough. He's probably already been deported. He's already been separated from his family. It's not enough, but we tell it because it's true to buy time to remember the humanness of
Yeah.
of these people so that we can keep struggling to actually free them from those chains.
I think that's, first of all, incredible. And I really urge people to go to I think that your Substack is Scenes from a Slow Civil War, right?
Yes, yeah, yeah.
And so Jeff Sharlet and people can find it there. That story is you'll easily find it, but it is it's important to continue. I think that that's like it's not exactly the same, but Cecile Richards, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
Cecile Richards. Her great quote was, "We lose, we lose, we lose, and then we win." And it's not exactly about this. It was about fighting for abortion rights, but it is about like we're not going to win in the near future. We're not gonna feel good about like all that we've accomplished, but really showing up right now. And I think one of the things that is powerful, which they want to discount, of course, is that people are beginning to show up, and people are beginning to show up in town halls, and people are beginning to show up in spaces, and in some ways it punctures this narrative that everything's going swimmingly, and the more we can force a different kind of narrative about like uncertainty and the uncertainty of the popularity of these initiatives, uncertainty around Elon Musk. And I do want to ask you specifically around Elon Musk, because it's almost, as a writer, like if you had to kind of create a villain out of like, whole cloth, like it's hard to imagine anyone more terrible than Elon Musk, who has kind of emerged from whatever shadows he was living in before I became aware of him as kind of an abstraction as the head of Tesla. And then all of a sudden, now look at him. I mean, he's really extraordinary in the way he's from the work at Doge, but then the salute and then the Holocaust jokes afterwards, and and et cetera, et cetera. So, give me your understanding of what is going on with him, Elon Musk, in this moment and how he fits into this broader conversation, because it's very interesting that in some ways he's eclipsed Donald Trump.
I wish I could remember who wrote this, and because I think it's important to give credit. Someone was writing online just about Elon Musk as a supervillain, a comic book supervillain. Beside which someone like Dick Cheney is a portrait in subtlety. And remember, Dick Cheney back in the day, people
Oh
sort of said
yeah,
this guy is
Darth
Darth
Vader.
Vader. Yeah,
Yes,
it's
yes.
like we don't normally. Most politicians sort of pretend like they're nice guys. Dick Cheney's like, no, I'm not nice. I'm gonna do dark things. Um, and but with Elon Musk, we get cut rate Lex Luthor. And I do mean cut rate because Lex Luthor, Superman's villain, was a genius inventor. And one thing to remember about Elon Musk is he is not actually a genius inventor. He is very, very, very good at consolidating power and consolidating the work of genius inventors. Um, and and he is very good, I think, at recognizing tools that most of us would overlook. And I'll give one and the worst example. I believe he was actually just named, they finally named him his real name yesterday in the New York Times, although, of course, the Department of Justice has warned journalists who identify his Elon's workers that maybe were committing a crime. Fortunately, I didn't read the article, so I don't know the man's name. I only know his supervillain name, Big Balls, the 19-year-old who goes by the name Big Balls, who
Oh
has
yeah.
been,
Uh,
and and we like to laugh at that, right? We like, look at these fools, look at these, these are th these are you almost want to master saboteurs. And it turns out a master saboteur is not someone who is savvy and cunning, a James Bond, sneaking in. It's a dork who calls himself Big Balls, who comes in and goes to the computers and pours soda on them so that they don't work, right? And that will break things. And I think Musk, um, I simultaneously want us to hold him in contempt, but also not to let that. I think the temptation right now is to see the cartoonishness and use that as a reassurance of ourselves for ourselves. Like, what a fool. Like, yeah, but that cartoon is a, whatever, a category 5 hurricane
right.
cutting a swath through our lives. Um, and we need to contend with it. I think, I was just talking to a colleague in journalism, Sonia Dirks, who's a journalist at NPR, and very interested. And we've long talked about the South African roots of Elon Musk. And I think those can be overstated if we get trapped into what's the psychology of Elon Musk. We're probably not going to be able to answer that. And I don't think it matters. What's the psychology of the hurricane? um, uh, Not so important, right? Like, what is the damage that it does? Um, but looking at that as a model for fascism that is markedly different than the mid-century European fascisms, the age of classical fascism, which is it's a minority rule fascism.
Hmm.
Um, the Germans did not appeal to minority rule; they appealed to majority rule. More recent contemporary governments that you could argue are fascist in the Philippines or in Indonesia or Brazil, they appealed to, if they didn't have the majority support, they appealed to a veneer of it, right? And they came close to it. Um, Apartheid in South Africa is a model of minority rule. And I think it's something that we should pay very close attention to with, Musk and Bezos and the billionaire who owns the LA Times and these figures who were tempted to read as iterations of capitalism, of which we have a critique, and yet they are something else.
Yeah.
Their wealth is so vast, they have almost immunized themselves from both capitalism and democracy. They don't have to submit to the market, and they don't have to seek a majority. And I think that's the insight that he's had and that he's advancing, and why all these sort of like, hey, great news, everybody, Musk's popularity numbers are down. Um, and
Yeah. Right. I mean, it's interesting, I wrote this piece that was, it seemed a little random after the inauguration, but like when Trump said we're in the golden age of America, and I'd interpret that as the Gilded Age. And, I do think there's parallels, but I actually think the Gilded Age, you know, um, well, the Gilded Age was before a lot of what we view as the accomplishments of the 20th century, which were the ability to fight back against monopolies, the ability to protect working people, all of those things that. So, we're in that moment. It'll be, it's hard to imagine what could possibly happen to Elon Musk given his incredible wealth. And But I do want to, ask your, thoughts on how, Elon Musk has said, I'm not a Christian, but I'm a cultural Christian.
Mm.
And by a cultural Christian, and I think you could say that for Donald Trump. He certainly wouldn't, I mean, no one would say he's a real Christian, but he has a,
Oh, I would.
yeah,
I would absolutely. I'd say they're
yeah,
both real Christians. I'd probably disagree with you there. And I
yeah,
think this is actually part of that was a question I sort of derailed on before, on the question of the info,
yeah,
the underground that has become the overstory, right, of Christian nationalism. And I think that's a big argument in the book The Undertow, and something that's sort of emerging ever more, and which is in the same way that fascism is a different order of right wing than very bad things that came before, like I would argue the Bush administration. Christian nationalism is not the same thing as the Christian right.
yeah,
Um, and part of why we keep missing it is we keep trying to measure its strength via church going, or I always think of them as like warlords, the big chieftains of the Christian right, all of whom have been pushed aside. I mean, Paulo White, nobody 20 years ago and said who's going to be the most powerful Christian right figure in America would have ever have picked Paulo
right,
White,
right.
Trump's faith advisor. But Christian nationalism, at like most religious nationalism, this is true of Hindu nationalism, it's true of the Christian nationalism in Russia. It it encourages a kind of fundamentalist relationship to the faith, but it insists that that relationship can be had outside of institutions. It's fundamentally anti-institution. Um, and so the reason I'll say that Trump is a Christian, that's not a compliment or an insult to me, although I have plenty of insults for him. That's just description, right? He calls himself a Christian. Okay. Now our understanding of Christianity has to be large enough to
Oh
include
yeah,
him, in the same
yeah,
way that I
that's
can't
fair.
write out all the
Yeah.
crusaders that I don't
No,
like,
no,
right?
no.
Yeah. No, I know you do. Yeah, I
Y-
agree with that. But and the fact that he doesn't go to church, the fact that he's absolutely unpious, the fact that Musk takes that step, or Jordan Peterson, if you've seen that awful interview between Jordan Peterson and Musk, and they're talking about Christianity, they take that step toward cultural Christianity, as they're putting it, is they're saying this is the paradigm under which we're going to organize and consolidate power.
right.
And we don't even actually, uh, uh, term one, we had to take a trip over there and talk to Mike Pence and kind of cut a deal. That's all fallen away.
Right.
Um, I'm a Christian because I am. That ASMR video, that's a Christian video. That's Christian
Mm,
music, right? That
mm,
is now the most powerful Christian on the planet has released this and said these are sounds of pleasure. And in
mm,
his mind, community, we can all enjoy together the sounds of chains clinking, binding another, right?
mm.
Casting out the evil. Um, uh, we have to contend with that. And I think those of you who are also Christians and in a very different faith tradition, I think you guys are on the front line as you
Well, we
have
have
been
to
for so
contend with that.
long.
True,
Yeah.
100%. I agree with you completely. By the way, I think what I was trying to use were the question, the other things you were talking about, like piety and concern.
Yeah. Yeah, and I
But
and
but
still
no,
that's such a that's a fight that we're still
oh
going. I
yeah,
mean, if you because so many secular people are like, "What? Ha ha, he's not really Christian, therefore this isn't real." Well, first of all, no, it's real. He's real. The power is there.
yeah,
And secondly, what are you achieving? It's an authenticity game
yeah, yeah,
that we've lost ahead of time. That
yeah,
down
yeah,
that path, we don't lose and lose and lose and lose. And then we win. Down that
yeah.
path, you lose and lose and lose until you forget what the game was.
Yeah, exactly. Listen, I really appreciate you know your all that you're doing right now. I don't come to you for happy hopey. I don't think anybody ever has, but I do think that you maybe have a vision that can see beyond the immediate horizon, and I'm curious if I can ask you about that right now. Like,
Yeah, I'm
what do you not that you can foretell the future, but what can you imagine that if we work hard and we do what we need to do, what might be a path forward for the United States to come through it, to go through this, but come out the other side?
I don't know if I have particular confidence that the United States will. I'm probably less optimistic. I think there could be elections in 28, and they could even be some semblance. I don't put a lot of faith in that, but I do think that coming through it, right? And that's sort of one of the things I was trying to write about in the undertow. We're going to have to go through this. My kids, next generation, everybody's kids is going to have to go through this. We're past the phase of like, what can we do to stop this and avert it? Now we can go through it, but we can have some faith that we will. We can have some faith in the chronology of time. And I think about you quoted Cecile, you lose, you lose, you lose, and then we win, right? It brought to mind another quote, and from a figure that we think of as so iconic and so distant from ourselves that we can't apply it to ourselves is MLK in some ways channeling Moses. I may not get there with you, right?
Mm,
Um, and I think that's part of that recognition of the going through it is not all of us are going to make it through.
mm,
Already today, we're observing the year anniversary of a friend's nephew, very brave young trans man, and who is kind of I found him a real hero. He's a guy who went to one of these big right-wing Mike Flynn rallies, stood in line just so he could shake Mike Flynn's hand and look him in the eye and say, you're shaking the hand of a trans man. Um, Not because he thought Mike Flynn would say, "Gosh, you are human." There was defiance in it. He took his life a year ago today. He's not going to get there with us. Other of us are not going to get there with us. And if that you follow me, that is a hopeful statement. When MLK, who was an icon, but look, we're all in that spot. MLK was not saying, "I may not get there with you like I am the greatest." All of us. This is a struggle. Some of us won't get there. And if we recognize that, what we recognize the fullness of that statement, the there, right? Not
mm,
all of us will see it. My
mm.
friend, my friend's nephew Ash isn't going to see it. You and I might not. Um, uh, those men being chained in that video, they've already, in many ways, been lost. Um, the case that the state of Washington, uh, uh, God bless them, bringing and the power and the testimony. If you read that one of their cases on against these anti-trans laws was a beautiful young person who, upon hearing of the executive order, took their own life, right?
Mm.
That person's not going to get there with it, but we are going to get there. That's what's in that statement. I may not get there with you. That's the hope. And that is a darker hope. I know that, right? But we're going to tell the story because it's true, right?
Mm.
That's a true story. We are going to get there. Um, we are going to get there. And let's bring as many of us along as we can.
Jeff Sharlet, thank you so much for speaking with us today on the state of belief and for all that you are doing in this moment.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for what you're doing.
Who do you know who would get a lot out of this discussion with Jeff Sharlet? Please share the State of Belief with them and be sure to subscribe to the State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. We need your help to keep making the State of Belief. Please make a financial contribution today at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I will be in conversation with Congressman Eric Swalwell of California. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch on the State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.